Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Charlie Kirk and Jimmy Kimmel, The Book of Job Today. What do we know about the Book of Job? Not very much. The hero complains endlessly. He has just lost his children and all his livestock. He scratches his ulcers. The misfortunes of which he complains are all duly enumerated in the prologue. They are misfortunes brought on him by Satan with God's permission. We think we know, but are we sure? Not once in the dialogues does Job mention either Satan or anything about his misdeeds. Could it be that they are too much on his mind for him to mention them? Possibly, yet Job mentions everything else, and does much more than mention. He dwells heavily on the cause of his misfortune, which is none of those mentioned in the prologue. The cause is not divine, satanic, nor physical, but merely human. Hey everybody, and today I want to develop some of the ideas I previously presented on Charlie Kirk and relate it to the controversy of Jimmy Kimmel's comments, temporary suspension, reinstatement, pseudo-apology. But I won't go into a huge amount of depth on the specifics of the Kimmel-Kirk controversy because that's been done to death and there's endless videos on that. But what I want to do is something slightly different. I want to relate it to the Book of Job and show in particularly the role of crowd or mob psychology in the Book of Job. And this is all going to be part of a playlist that I'm developing with hopefully some live streams with a theology student I know quite well. And the idea is going to be called something like An Agnostic Guide to the Bible, on the basis that it's not supposed to be religious. In fact, religious people might get something from, a close study of some biblical text, but it's much more about the psychology and some of the philosophy and literary aspects of the Bible and how they can still inform present day debates. So I was struck by how much of the Charlie Kirk Kimmel controversy was laced with relevance to such an ancient text as the Book of Job, the notion of scapegoating, the voice of the crowd, the adversary, all these things which I'll get into. So I'm going to do that via this particular text, which is Rene Girard's Job, the Victim of His People. And I hope to do more in future of Girard. I've been looking for an excuse to do some of his work already, and I never got quite round to it. But he only has two basic ideas, which is about mimetic behaviour, which is the copying of other people. So it's mimetic desire is one of his key things. He argues that desire is driven by our response to other people's desire, and that's how it's structured. And then the other key idea he has is scapegoating, the way in which society gains some of its cohesion by picking on individuals, and the people who pick on that individual adopt a self-righteousness, which I think is amazingly relevant to our time of the self-appointed, ideological purists, the cultural Maoists that dominate discourse these days. And, woe betide anyone who dares to put their head above the parapet, which will be a major theme of today. So the voice I'm going to propose, you've got Kimmel, but you've got Stephen Colbert here, you've got John Oliver, you've got Jon Stewart, you've got other podcast characters like Joe Rogan, Dave Smith, Bill Maher, there's The View, and I'm sure there's Piers Morgan type people, so I want to give someone from vaguely the right wing to balance things up a little bit. But what interests me is we'll get into it shortly, the notion of performance and how these people are the guardians of a certain type of morality, or better still, better phrase might be an ideology, the purity of a certain way of seeing the world. And it's a theme that gets developed in the Book of Job. So interspersed with the sections from Rene Girard, all the quotes I'm going to use are going to either be from the Book of Job or from Rene Girard's commentary and it'll be obvious which is which. So they're going to be the only quotes I'll be using. And the artwork I always use to intersperse quotes. Today it's going to be from William Blake. And I'll be honest, I've never really warmed to William Blake's work. This appeals to me much more than his watercolours. This is like Gustave Doré. I've always liked the ink effect, the darkness and the lightness. It's so cleverly done. But this is 1793, I think, one of these, and this was a later. He gave more detail. This was circa 1820 to 1825. So these are just etchings. I won't be using these. I'll be using some watercolours, and there were two sets. One was called the Butts collection, Butts, and one was called the Linnell, and they were separated by a couple of decades. Now, I'm going to use just the Butts today, and if I do a follow-up video to this, I will use the Linnell, so you'll get to see, hopefully, both collections of illustrations. So to jump straight ahead. So this is Girard, and then it's a quote from the Book of Job. The scapegoat is the innocent party who polarizes a universal hatred, which is precisely the complaint of Job, which this is the direct quote. And now ill will drives me to distraction, and a whole host molests me, rising like some witness for the prosecution, to utter slander to my very face. In tearing fury it pursues me with gnashing teeth. My enemies whet their eyes on me and open gaping jaws. Their insults strike like slaps in the face, and all set on me together. Now, why I find this, it might be bizarre to some of you, but why I find this really relevant to today is it's a heartfelt complaint about the type of almost palpable nastiness you can find online, and the way in which people will gang up on other people. You know, the idea that it's a free marketplace of ideas has become slightly risible now. But this, I'm more interested in this palpable sense of a crowd creating its own cohesion through the persecution and prosecution of other people. The scapegoat is a huge issue that Girard addresses in his work, and I will devote more time to that in future, because obviously I want to keep this within reasonable bounds, the length of this video. So here's the first illustration from William Blake. So this is the Butt set from 1806, and I'll just give the titles of the illustrations or the accompanying text each time. So this is Job and his family. So this is before it all hits the fan, so to speak. Would he punish you for your piety and hale you off to judgment? No, rather for your manifold wickedness, for your unending iniquities. You have exacted needless pledges from your brothers, and men go naked now through your despoiling. You have grudged water to the thirsty man, and refused bread to the hungry. You have narrowed the lands of the poor man down to nothing, to set your crony in his place, sent widows away empty-handed, and crushed the arms of orphans. So this is from one of the, you say accusers, they're supposed to be friends, and I'm going to do a detailed video on the structure of the Book of Job, so please forgive me if I do a skate over some of these issues and who's saying what to whom at particular points. But I just wanted to show you his friends. They're supposed to be his friends, and they actually end up, they're the accusers who represent, they're a microcosm of the wider society that's suddenly turned against Job. But what Girard picks out is the way in which this type of antipathy or envy that's inherent in what's being said here, that there's a gleefulness that slowly builds and leads to the crowd mob psychology. And the accusation being made here, it reminded me of a lot of modern ideology when people are accusing it. It's the oppressor narrative. Everyone you oppose is an oppressor. When you go back through history, there were oppressors, and we want reparations, and it's all fueled by this sort of spirit that's contained within this section. So this is Girard's subsequent comment. We modern readers eagerly accept the vision of the prologue because it fits our own world, or at least our idea of it. This is the prologue where what happened, basically it gives an overview of, obviously in a prologue, of what's to come, but it basically mentions how happy and prosperous Job was before calamity hit. Happiness consists of having as many possessions as possible without ever becoming ill, of enjoying an eternal frenzy of consumer pleasure. In the dialogues, on the other hand, the only thing that counts is Job's relationship with the community. So this is a key emphasis Girard places upon his particular reading of the book of Job. He basically argues that there's a prologue and there's a conclusion. But for him, Girard, and don't shoot the messenger, I'm just telling you what Girard says. Girard suggests that it's the dialogues. It's when Job is in conversation with his so-called friends and with the voice from the whirlwind, with God, his wife, etc. That's where the crux for Girard of the whole significance of the book of Job lies, because that's where he sees the voice of the crowd that's hidden behind, it's claimed to be, all the people accusing Job claim to be speaking in the voice of God, or justified, they are righteous and they are justified by God. And Girard's saying, no, this is just a cover for an age-old social process of scapegoating. And that's what makes what aspects of the Bible, like the book of Job, I think fascinating, even if you're an agnostic, and we'll talk about this in future. I don't really believe in the notion of atheism. I find it self-contradictory. If you actively believe there is no God, to me, that's a form of belief. So you either believe or you're an agnostic, you're open to persuasion. But to just unilaterally say, I insist there is no God, you've got as much evidence as for people who say there is. So that's interesting, but from the agnostic point of view, you don't need to believe in God to see the mechanism that Girard's drawing attention to, this way in which people use the notion of righteousness. In this particular instance, they're hiding behind God, claiming they're speaking on his behalf. I'd suggest in the modern context, because we live in quite irreligious times, although maybe at a future date talk about the revival in some senses of Christianity in the Western world as a reaction to various things. But this eternal frenzy of consumer pleasure, the ideology, there is, what he's pointing to here is, for the accusers of Job, they're actually quite godless. It's the eternal frenzy of consumer pleasure. They're having as many possessions as possible. And in modern terms, I'd suggest that's akin to, there's an emptiness to the most ideologically pure and driven people, the people I now call today cultural Maoists. There's an emptiness, and they insist upon incredibly dogmatically their ideological perspective on the world. By contrast, in this section, Job is much more bothered about his relationship with his community. For Job, it's all about social relations. For his accusers, it's all about materialism. The things that Job had that they didn't drove their jealousy and envy. And I'm going to argue throughout this video that in contemporary terms, there are ideologically driven people who I think have substituted any notion of God, because they're godless, they don't believe in God. But rather than become humanists, there's almost this weird substitution of the spirit of God or a sense of religion. They've substituted their particularly dogmatic notion of ideology. And for Girard, his point is that this type of ideology that's unforgiving, it's the people accusing Job in the actual book of Job, they're using godly language, but actually it's the spirit of what's called, in the story, the adversary, that's also being translated as Satan. And I'm suggesting in modern times, this voice of the crowd that often people like Jimmy Kimmel represent, They are that spirit in this mode of self-righteousness, in this mode of being right and defending, inverted commas, good values. They're doing what the accusers do in the book of Job. They're hiding behind righteous language, but actually they're engaging in scapegoating techniques. This is Satan before the throne of God, is the title given to it, or the description. The scapegoat is a shattered idol. The rise and fall of Job are bound up in one another. The two extremes seem to be connected. They cannot be understood separately, and yet one is not the cause of the other. We sense an ill-defined but very real social phenomenon in the probable unfolding of events. The one thing in common between the two periods is the community's unanimity, first in worship, then later in loathing. Job is the victim of a huge and sudden reversal of public opinion that is obviously unstable, capricious, and void of all moderation. He seems hardly more responsible for the change in this crowd than Jesus is for a similar change between Palm Sunday and Good Friday. So what Girard's drawing attention to is this mode of people, it's the shattering of idols. The scapegoat tends to start off in a very privileged position, but then it's the reversal, and people get glee from the rise and fall. And the italicization and emphasis, the emboldening of these phrases, the community's unanimity, and a huge and sudden reversal of public opinion that is obviously unstable, capricious, and void of all moderation. That's my emboldening and italicization, because I think they speak directly to, keep trying to, I find there's a palpable, and it's contradictory, because when you go online, by definition it's non-physical, but there's an almost palpable, I'm using it metaphorically, this almost touchable feeling of some of the nastiness and the self-righteousness, and it's a place where people go to engage in this incredibly capricious notion of public opinion and void of all moderation. I think whatever side of the political spectrum you were on, I think most reasonable people would agree that moderation is hardly the dominant social value at the moment. For this dual unanimity to exist, the mimetic contagion of the crowd must be at work. Again, I've emboldened that. Members of the community influence each other reciprocally. They imitate each other in fanatical worship, and then in even more fanatical hostility. So given that Girard's describing what's going on in the book of Job and Job's rise and fall, again, to underline the point, I hope you can see the relevance of this to today's online atmosphere. And this is Job's sons and daughters overwhelmed by Satan. And will you still follow the ancient trail trodden by the wicked, those men who were born off before their time, with rivers swamping their foundations because they said to God, "Go away. What can Shaddai do to us?" Yet he himself had filled their houses with good things, while these wicked men shut him out of their councils. At the sight of their ruin, good men rejoice, and the innocent deride them. See how their greatness is brought to nothing. See how their wealth has perished in the flames. And El Shaddai is God Almighty in biblical terms. And have I emboldened, italicized, I think it's a beautiful phrase, the ancient trail trodden by the wicked. So the point Girard, I'll show you shortly, picks up on is this ancient trail. He argues that this scapegoating of people, this picking upon them, is an ancient thing. It's a mechanism that's gone on since time immemorial. And because we live in times of advanced technology and because we think of ourselves as so much more advanced, I'd suggest we don't recognize this ancient trail that the Book of Job describes so brilliantly. So this is Girard speaking again. The events recalled by Eliphaz, because he's just the person who just said that, one of the so-called friends of Job, seem distant and therefore unusual, but not so unusual as to prevent the observer from recognizing in them a recurring phenomenon. The path has already been traced. Many men have already taken it, and now it is Job's turn. All these tragic destinies share the characteristic profile of the shattered idol. Their destiny, like Job's, is inevitably determined by the transformation of a crowd of worshippers into a crowd of persecutors. So if you want a modern example of this, I think of J.K. Rowling, who was lionized, one of the most successful authors in the world. And suddenly, because she dared to insist upon biological reality, she became an accursed figure. This transformation of a crowd of worshippers into a crowd of persecutors. And this idea of idols that was referred to previously, idols are wont to be shattered. They're intrinsically fragile. And again, I'd make the link to modern ideology, the sense in which the things that are idolized have very little depth or substance to them, which then informs the capriciousness and the way in which the mood of public opinion can vary so drastically. There's no consistency because of, and they compensate, but because there's so little actual substance to it, they then compensate by this extreme ideological purity and an obsession over things like pronouns. Things that are so empty, intrinsically empty, become imputed with so much so-called significance. And this is the messengers told Job of his misfortune. The disaster that awaits the wicked at the final stage, at the end of the ancient trail, must resemble those primitive feasts which, in spite of their moderated and ritualistic nature, remind us of a crowd phenomenon. Such social dramas always end with a simulated drowning or immolation of a scapegoat. Former ethnologists sensed the existence of a more extreme violence behind the ritual forms they observed. So this is key. For those that you're familiar with the channel, the previous video and a few before that, I've been looking at Franz Kafka's work. And when I focused upon in the previous video, The Judgment, the short story, that would be a perfect example of this. Such social dramas always end with the simulated drowning or immolation of a scapegoat. In that short story by Kafka, and Kafka was deeply agnostic stroke atheist, there is a God-sized hole in all of his work. But he actually, in many of his works, the end of the trial, like a dog, he thought the shame of it would outlive him. I'm paraphrasing badly the final line. He's killed in the trial. And it's this, I think Kafka's a brilliant exponent of this notion of the scapegoat. But what Girard talks about in a lot of his work is this way in which very, very primitive, atavistic human traits, this ancient trail, the wicked at the final stage, at the end of the ancient trail, these primitive feasts, the social dramas that we've seen with the Kimmel and Kirk controversy, they have resonance with this ancient trail. The way in which Kirk was scapegoated and he's become the ultimate scapegoat by losing his life over his pursuit of public debate. And then it's been interesting. I've had a bit of pushback, but people seem to focus upon, did Charlie Kirk debate the best possible way? Was he a saint? Rather than focus on the actual process that's occurred. An innocent man who could only ever be accused of being guilty, if he ever was guilty, of not being your political cup of tea. And I was just slightly taken aback by the minimalist nature of the accusations against him. And often they seem to be quite manufactured, because when you looked at what he'd actually said, and you hear evidence from people who knew him well, there seemed to be so much fabrication ex post facto, trying to make him some type of person somehow deserving of his fate. And otherwise reasonable people, their inability to understand that the most significant aspect of the whole Charlie Kirk tragedy was the tragic element, the death, trying to mitigate it with all these like semi-excuses. That's as good as it got from Charlie Kirk's political opponents. And then, of course, you had the people actively celebrating, which is a whole other level of this public opinion that's actually contained within the book of Job, this rejoicing at other people's misfortune. It's a key theme. Many contemporary scholars regard them as victims of their own romantic and colonialist imagination. This is the notion of the scapegoat. I'll explain this in a second. Yeah, I think that the earlier ethnologists were right. No doubt they had their prejudices, but we also have ours. The fervent Rousseauian dogma of today ignores the massive evidence that contradicts it, and thus hardly inspires confidence. This is slightly technical, but what Girard's talking about, in the work of people like Rousseau, there's this concept of the noble savage, and Rousseau was incredibly influential on a lot of modern sociology and political ways of thinking, to the extent that I've encountered this. If I've referred to in certain talks I've done to the concept of original sin, not from a religious perspective, but just as a metaphor in the Bible and in writers like Kierkegaard, they talk about original sin as a jumping off point for quite complex psychological discussions. And if nothing else, you don't have to be religious to believe that there is a predisposition within humanity. This is Kierkegaard's point. Because we have choices, that's what gives us our freedom. But with that freedom, it's inevitable that some of those choices are going to be the wrong choices, and that's how sin arises. So original sin, according to someone like Kierkegaard, is an inextricably linked aspect of being human. To be human is to err. And that's what original sin can be interpreted, again, as this notion of the agnostic guide to the Bible. But even at that level, I've encountered people who will argue that no one's born evil. And that's not the point. We can argue the toss whether anyone is born evil. You know, some murderous killers, you suspect they are. But let's just say they're not. That's not the point. It's still the point about the book of Genesis onwards. When you eat of the apple, the tree of knowledge, you have choices, you have free will, and sin comes from that. I don't want to get sidetracked onto a whole discussion about the book of Genesis, but this idea that people, you can't discuss original sin without people having this knee-jerk reaction because they don't want to talk in religious terms. I won't dwell on this, but hopefully we'll explore it in future. But you don't have to be religious. This is what I want to keep underlining, to see the significance of religious texts and how they represent ideas like original sin that might be pitched in religious terms, but actually have much, much wider psychological and sociological significance. And someone like Rousseau, that Girard's referring to here, takes the exact opposite course. He developed this weird, bizarre idea of the noble savage, that in our primeval state, we were all cooking each other lentil dinners and being incredibly nice to each other, and there isn't a harmful instinct in humankind until you're ruined by civilization. I just think it's a shame our Rousseau didn't sod off to the headhunters and experience the primal Garden of Eden at first hand, returning without his head connected. But anyway, this is called Satan going forth from the presence of the Lord. On him God looses all his burning wrath, hurling against his flesh a hail of arrows. No use to run away from the iron armoury, for the bow of bronze will shoot him through. Out through his back an arrow sticks, from his gall a shining point. An arsenal of terrors falls on him, and all that is dark lies in ambush for him. A fire unlit by man devours him, and consumes what is left in his tent. The heavens lay bare his iniquity. The earth takes its stand against him. A flood sweeps his house away, and carries it off in the day of wrath. Such is the fate God allots to the wicked. Such is his inheritance assigned by God. And I think that was from memory Zophar speaking, one of the friends. But this is the point I think Girard makes throughout his work. This is the unanimous voice of condemnation of society. But it's put into sacralized form. In other words, it's dressed up in the language of God. They're adopting the authority of God in order to pursue their vendetta. And again, just to re-emphasize the point, I think this has strong parallels with the situation we're in today, where people, it explains to me, it made me think afresh of the paradox whereby the ideology of tolerance and diversity seems to consist of a disproportionate number of people who are intolerant and will not tolerate a single diverse idea that departs from their worldview. So that paradox, I think, is contained in sections like this of the Book of Job. People using righteous language as a guise for their own ends. And this is Satan smiting Job with boils. I think you can see in Satan's left hand he has a jar of boil. What's the opposite of a medicine? Boil lotion. The main theme in the harangues of the Friends is the gigantic mobilization started by God, decreed and organized by him, so as to attack his own enemy. Countless hordes converge on the poor man. Where do they come from? Why do mighty armies assemble for the sole purpose of destroying one isolated adversary who cannot even defend himself? Why such a waste of military power? Along with the bands of warriors and the natural disasters are the creatures that are fighting for God. They gather round their victim to descend on him together, having come from the four corners of the universe. The same species reappear constantly in these bizarre tales. Bulls, dogs, birds of prey, especially vultures. These vultures swarm around even the smallest carcass, forming a circle around him so as to share the spoils. All of these animals and many more can be found in myths. It is, of course, the most ferocious species that are chosen. But, and I've emphasized this bit, also those that live in herds, those that hunt and attack collectively, or that feed together on carcasses, species that behave or seem to behave like men gathered against a common enemy, for example, when they participate in a manhunt. Yet again, that to me embodies, encapsulates a lot of the online atmosphere. This is Job's comforters. The multiplicity of enemies is always based on the same model, the human crowd. As divine vengeance begins its preparations, there is nothing in the universe that resists the growing turbulence. Woe betide the person who is at the centre of this irresistible whirlwind, who lets himself be caught. The seething crowd is the perfect vehicle for divine vengeance. It hurls itself at the victim and tears him to pieces. All the participants share the same terrible appetite for violence. No one wishes to miss striking the final blow. The images of laceration and fragmentation remind us of the endless mythical and ritual dismemberments and the innumerable versions of the Dionysiac diasparagmos. Slap on my wrist for that mispronunciation. But this is, I won't go into too much gory detail, but the diasparagmos is this, they believe, and again, this goes to Girard, he was alluding to it earlier on, when he talked about the Rousseauian ethnologists, the studiers of human society, who didn't believe that human sacrifice was a very common practice. And in ancient Greece, it's one of these very ambiguous things. There's no one quite knew what went on in the Dionysian rites. But in the Bacchae by Euripides, there is Pentheus is the king who falls out of a tree while trying to observe one of these Dionysian rites and gets torn apart limb from limb, literally, not metaphorically. And his mother, I'm laughing, but she's under this frenzied Dionysian manic splurge, and she goes back to the village waving, I think it's his shoulder bone of her own son, and finally she comes to her senses and realises what she's done. So that's a cheery description, isn't it? But the human crowd, I think Girard's, his work's incredibly valuable for the way in which Girard emphasises the way in which divine vengeance gets repackaged as the violence of the crowd. And again, I think people talk about modern trends, things that are happening, and because we're so technologically based now, I personally just get the sense that people talk around and around about the same issues, woke this, trans that, and there's very little progress ever made. Whereas I actually think if you go back to something like the Book of Job, the way Girard does, you get to see some of the underlying trends and processes that have been with us on this ancient trail. There's that beautiful phrase. And whether it's biblical times or a similar time in Greek culture, 600, 700 BC, this notion of the Dionysiac diasparagmos. Diasparagmos. I'm going to keep practicing that. And here we are, Boily Job. Job's Despair, this is called. It wasn't called Boily Job. Words too form a crowd, countless. They swirl about the head of the victim, gathering to develop the coup de grace. The three series of speeches are like volleys of arrows aimed at the enemy of God. The accusations descend on Job like so many adversaries, intent upon the destruction of some friend. Their hostile speeches are not merely an image of collective violence, they are a form of active participation in it. Job is well aware of this and denounces the verbal dismemberment to which he is subjected. The three friends crush him with their speeches and pulverize him with words. And this is the actual section. I think when Girard quotes from the Bible, he's using the New Jerusalem translation, I think. The one I've taken here, because he doesn't give the actual words from the Book of Job, he just references them. This is from I'm old-fashioned, I like the King James, ye old version. How long will ye vex my soul and break me in pieces with words, is the King James version. And shame on anyone who uses a different version. This is called the vision of Eliphaz. Is it an exaggeration to associate these words with a lynching? The friends do not express themselves in gross insults, nor do they engage in physical brutalities. They do not spit on Job. After all, they are members of the elite. Is Job not guilty of gross exaggeration and over dramatization? Absolutely not. By equating all the acts of violence against Job with services rendered to God, these speeches justify past brutalities and incite new ones. They are more formidable than any spitting. Their performative value is obvious. And I find I've italicized performative. That was my reference earlier on to people like Jimmy Kimmel and company, the late night TV hosts. And it's interesting how many of them are from a actor background, or generally they tend to be comedians. And I find that interesting, that where increasingly most of our political discussion, or at least in America, a lot of political discussion is filtered through the perceptions of comedians, performers. And this is worthy of future exploration, but the concept of, I'm one of the last people, actually, this is one of the ironies, I've always said hurty words don't count. And anyone in favour of free speech, this is the tightrope you always walk, because if words don't hurt, what happens when, in recent times, words are curated and used to such an extent that eventually someone like Charlie Kirk is killed? And this is one of the elements to think of, the way Girard is claiming. And it's also I think one of the complexities of Girard's work is, in modern times, mechanisms such as scapegoating, which he analyzes, in our day to day, some of these things have been subtly reversed. So, victimhood, for example, the way Girard writes, and in the book of Job, there's a clear victim. That is Job. He's guiltless, but he still suffers. The modern ideological reinterpretation of this is victimhood is applied often to the people who are, as I pointed out before, most intolerant and most aggressive. And they're the ones most likely to shout out about, you've got to use the right words, you've got to use the right pronouns, yet they're simultaneously also those most prone to violence, political violence. This is Job rebuked by his friends. The speeches of the friends reflect the sacred fury that takes hold of lynchers as the lynching draws near. From Dionysiac mania to Polynesian amok, there are 1,000 different ways of indicating a collective trance that is also found in Greek tragedy. These inflammatory tirades are like those of the tragic chorus in the moments that precede the destruction of the victim, such as the murder of Pentheus I mentioned earlier in the Bacchae, and the discovery of the culprit in Oedipus Rex. So this is, I've mentioned it briefly in the past, but Nietzsche's concept of the birth of tragedy. And for Nietzsche, the importance of Greek tragedy was the way in which it allowed this catharsis, this way of processing the violence inherent in society. So the Dionysiac mania. So rather than a religious rite where the sparagmos actually took place, the dismembering, it was sublimated into Greek tragic theatre in a beautiful, stunning way that helped societal cohesion, because you had all the citizens gathered to witness Greek theatre. So it was cathartic, it helped social cohesion. We lack that type of literary outlet now. And what we're left with is the Dionysiac mania without a productive outlet. And it's interesting, this Polynesian amok, I think we get the English word amok from the Polynesian original, I think is A-M-U-K, amok. But it's there's actually amok syndrome is in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, when people just go berserk. This is Job's evil dreams. Under our very eyes, the three friends sacralize the violence. The insults and meanness are metamorphosed into the grandiose accomplishments of a supernatural mission. The celestial warriors are in fact everyone involved, neighbours from near and far, the affluent as well as the barefoot, the young and the old, long-term friends and close relatives, even Job's elderly wife who says to him, "Curse God and die." Nice. Lovely spouse you've got there, Job. This is the wrath of Elihu. Since they are participating in his lynching, Job's friends do not understand that he is playing the role of scapegoat. Here the paradox of generative violence is revealed in a spectacular way. Those who create the sacred with their own violence are incapable of seeing its truth. This is what makes the friends totally deaf to the appeals Job is constantly making. The more they participate in violence against the unfortunate man, the more they are carried away by their own barbaric lyricism, and the less they understand what they are doing. I would put this on the mission statements of most modern day universities, because I think it describes the mentality of quite a lot of campus protesters. The more they participate in violence, the more they are carried away by their own barbaric lyricism, and the less they understand what they're doing. So the self-righteousness, often borderline illiterate, is what carries them away. This is the Lord answering Job out of the whirlwind. Without men's tendency to imitate each other's desires, envy would not be so extraordinarily powerful in human society. Envy is merely the reciprocal borrowing of desires under conditions of sufficient equality to ensure the development of mimetic rivalries. The notion of mimetic rivalries is fresh with me because at the time of filming, the minute I finish filming this, I'm off to see the very final session of the Ryder Cup. And I have no interest year round in golf. I've never played it. But there's something about the Ryder Cup, the US versus Europe, and the mimetic rivalry that I find absolutely fascinating. And I've just spent the last 2.5 days having to listen to particularly, forgive me to the American audience, but boorish American crowd in Long Island shouting, "In the hole!" endlessly. It's, yeah, I think it's safe to say the purpose of golf is to put the ball in the hole. But how so many people can just repeat the same inane refrain is almost beyond me. So I've even been putting my meals out to myself going, "In the bowl!" It becomes very mimetically driven. Watched on all sides, the idol runs the risk of being transformed into a scapegoat as a result of the slightest mistake. The mimesis of envy and hatred spreads as rapidly as the mimesis of admiration. It is the same mimesis that is transmuted when the model becomes obstacle, and mimesis scandalized by this metamorphosis. I'll develop this in future because it's a complex aspect of the mimetic theory of Girard. It's basically the way in which, when the model of your envy, so one of the aspects of modern society is in past times, let's say you're a serf, like in a Monty Python film, walking through fields of mud. Monty Python and the Holy Grail springs to mind. And the lord of the manor, your social betters, are so distant from you. Your envy might be strong, but you've never really got the opportunity to act on it. Whereas in modern society, the people around us that we're envious of are much closer to being our peers. So when they become an obstacle to us, at least we perceive them to be an obstacle for us getting what they may have, that's when the violence is much more likely within the community, because there's a lack of distance between you, the thing you want, and the perceived person who's stopping you getting it. And when someone like Karl Marx says religion is the opium of the masses, to the extent that that's true, it's based upon you believe in a transcendent being. So any rivalry you have can be displaced onto that transcendent being that you can aspire to but never be able to challenge. Whereas in modern society, the people, to repeat, around us are our peers, and they are the perceived obstacles, which there's an impetus to try and overcome that obstacle, and that's where a lot of social friction comes from. And this is called When the Morning Stars Sang Together. The righteous man is very clear about the element of envy in his positive imitation, but when that envy becomes more intense as a result of the obstacle, the scandal, of the triumph of the wicked, this imitation turns to hatred and is no longer recognised as such by the righteous. Yet, if any envy is worthy of the name, this is it. In the moment of crisis, the righteous man does not recognise that his counter-imitation, his extreme resentment, is a result of his envy. He sees it as the very best of sentiments, religious fervour at its purest. There is only one unique element of mystification left, but it is the most important, for he resembles the friends whose extreme envy becomes religious hysteria. So again, a future topic that's got a lot of depth to it, but I think Nietzsche was talking about ressentiment, resentment, and its relationship to envy. And again, I hope you can see the relevance to modern times. It's not religious hysteria today that we suffer from, it's ideological hysteria. If you don't agree with me, I will have a hissy fit. This is called Behemoth and Leviathan. My brothers have been as fickle as a torrent, as the course of a seasonal stream. Ice is the food of their dark waters. They swell with the thawing of the snow. But in the hot season they dry up. With summer's heat they vanish. And I want to explore that. There's a list of things I want to explore, but it's endless, the Book of Job. This concept of a torrent. And in the case of Charlie Kirk and Jimmy Kimmel, the torrent of abuse, I think is highly relevant. Only a very strong resistance to mimetic contagion can safeguard that independence. You earlier talked about the concept of trying to maintain independence. All mimetic sentiments are of a kind. Stupid fads of fashion result in the fierce exclusion of scapegoats. Immunity to mimesis is a very rare and precious quality. This really isn't a talk for someone with a stutter, is it? Not that I have a stutter, but I've got like a self-generated one now. By trying to say mimesis too often. I sound like a muppet. The same people who stir up popular hatred for Job used to elbow their way to the front of the flatterers. We think they have changed, but the change is part of their mimetic nature. It is the opposite of freedom. They are merely particles of the crowd. That's Girard. I think it's stunning. It's the opposite of freedom. They are merely particles of the crowd. And again, young people, well, searching for some type of identity, overcompensating by insisting upon, you know, self-identifying as badgers, insisting upon particular pronouns. It is the opposite of freedom. They are merely particles of the crowd. That's what Girard thinks about your badger identity. This is called the fall of Satan. The metaphor of the torrent not only indicates the absence of what is most desirable, whatever that may be, but also the superabundant, overwhelming presence of the undesirable, whatever equally that may be. The accursed stream eventually always brings us what it has made us desire by depriving us of it. But at the very moment it brings it, we no longer desire it. We even avoid it like the plague, so that from now on it is the plague. What was unobtainable yesterday should cease to be unobtainable only by appearing in reasonable amounts. Instead, it can be found everywhere. It invades, submerges, and supplants everything ad nauseum. We are overwhelmed. We think we are stuck with it forever, and we are, for a season. We wish it to the devil. This absence of moderation, the perpetual combination of lack and excess, characterizes a universe that has surrendered to mimeticism. And I just think that final couple of paragraphs, well, all three describe again the online mentality, the lack of any focus, this just inchoate, undirected sense of desire that's got no outlet, no catharsis, as I mentioned earlier. This is called the vision of Christ. Those who best understand this form of desire are so disconcerted that they attribute it to the hostile machinations of an evil spirit. Obviously, the demon has but one aim: to harm humanity. The Satan or that is known as the Adversary of the prologue, plays the role that the three friends attribute to God, the same role that the torrent plays in Job's metaphor, the insane community of mimesis. Desire mistakes its own projections for reality. The image of the torrent describes the world not as it is, but as it appears to men when their desire is exacerbated, when the prohibitions that protect them from implacable rivalries have collapsed. That's what I was referring to earlier, when the object of your desire and the obstacle to it become too close and you don't have this social separation. This is called Job's sacrifice. But the image of the torrent also describes an objective metamorphosis of the world. The initial subjective semblance quickly becomes reality under the influence of desire, which always leaves its mark. Being mimetic, it spreads mimesis everywhere and achieves its own diffusion efficiently without any effort. We constantly experience the rebound of its ever-increasing effects through the mimetic mirror of the other's desire, so that the world becomes in reality what our desire has made it. I think this is absolutely key for understanding the borderline insanity of identity politics. This phrase, the initial subjective semblance, quickly becomes reality under the influence of desire, which always leaves its mark, increasingly in a medical sense. The initial subjective semblance quickly becomes reality under the influence of desire. So what you want, it has to be reality. And the mimetic mirror of the other's desire, this notion of social contagion in a mimetic world, mirror of the other's desire. I think what Girard would say is that in ancient times these processes existed, but if you think of the mirror of online social media, it's exponentially worse. This is called Every Man Also Gave Him a Piece of Money. So this is the end when everything is given back to Job. As the world becomes more mimetic, it's increasingly more misleading and deceptive in the same sense as Job's torrent. If I were to believe in a world where the only things worth seeking are not to be found, a world where nothing that is available is worth having, I should share actively in its fabrication. My subjective vision and reality would quickly coalesce, bringing about the disappearance of everything worthy of desire, and the creation in ever more monstrous quantities of the undesirable and insignificant. Again, I think this is really descriptive of modern times. The lack of substantial, genuine meaning and what gets substituted for it. In a society ruled by mimetic desire, everyone shares in making existence as barren as the desert, but no one is aware of it. Affluenza. As in well-ordered societies, people only do what they see done around them. So the mimetic behaviour of students on campuses. This is called Job and His Daughters. In a world controlled by mimetic desire, all individuals tend to banish each other and therefore themselves to some kind of desert. If we observe this secret relationship between individual situations, the identical alienation in everyone that isolates each one of us, then it is not hard to understand that the appetite for violence may grow and may ultimately be satisfied at that moment when the global tendency to uniformity focuses the mimetic substitutions and polarizations on some victim or other, or perhaps not so randomly, but on a victim who is more vulnerable because of his visibility, one who is somehow predestined by the exceptional position he holds in the community, someone like Job, or dare I say it, someone like Charlie Kirk. And this is Job and his family restored to posterity. And I'll finish with one, I think, very poignant image that draws upon most of what I've been talking about today. So until the next time, all the very best. Take care.